Now and then, every photographer will come across an issue that isn't as common, and that is fine hairs on the face. It can become really difficult to figure out how to deal with that, but I want to show you a couple of techniques on how to make quick order of that situation. An issue that sometimes happens with portraits, depending on how you light, is seeing fine hairs on the face. Now, this isn't a problem because a lot of people have it, believe it or not. Especially if you do beauty work or macro work on portraits or cosmetics, you'll see it happen more regularly. And the sharper cameras get and the sharper the lenses get in resolving the detail, the more you're going to see it start to happen. Now, what I want to show you in this tutorial is basically how to minimize the appearance of fine hairs on the face. You can't completely neutralize it realistically, but there's tricks that you can use to minimize that appearance of how they look. This portrait was shot by Sue, and I'm using this portrait because the way the light hit the face, you start noticing a few fine hairs along the sides of the face and the jawline, and it's, like I said, pretty common. But the techniques we can use to deal with that are something we've talked about quite a lot before, utilizing the healing brush and the clone brush. So make sure that if you haven't seen the healing brush and the clone brush section, check them out in fundamentals before checking this tutorial out as well. So aside from the background, I'm going to click on a blank layer. And on this blank layer, I'm going to start by using the healing brush. And the healing brush itself is going to be used to minimize some of the most obvious hairs. And then I'm going to use a clone brush to tackle the rest of it. I think that's a better workflow for me. And the reason for that is you can't deal with everything all in one go. Otherwise, you're going to create a mess. It's just like the philosophy we use for the entire retouching workflow. We want to take it step by step and logistically. Otherwise, it can become really problematic. And what we're trying to go for is realism. Because let's face it, like I said, when cameras start to get more and more detailed, you can't rely on some of these older techniques to make sense of these newer files, because what might work for an image that's not as sharp won't really work for an image that's totally in focus, because it doesn't hide, these shortcuts that people tend to do when they're retouching. So I want to show you the proper way of doing this. First thing first is we need to select the healing brush. So I'll use my shortcut, which is A. And like I said before, check out the fundamentals section for the healing brush, the clone brush, but also keyboard shortcuts because we utilize them a lot. So I'll go to my healing brush, and I have my sample size set to current and below. Again, my hardness of my brush is always 0%, and my size will continuously change. I am going to start utilizing some of the helper layers now, and the helper layer that I will utilize is the black and white helper layer and the grain helper layer. The reason why I utilize both of them is because the grain helper layer is going to remove the things that are not as necessary to look at. So let me show you an example. If I zoom in here really quick, because I have my grain on and I turn that off, what I'll find is that when I increase my opacity, it's going to stop me from over-focusing on all the detail. Because when you stop and look at everything that is going on in this area, it's easy to become overwhelmed. However, when I turn the grain on, it breaks apart that detail. And that's really beneficial for us because it makes us realize that there's only a few hairs that become really obvious to take care of. And the rest kind of disappear when you zoom out. Okay, so it's almost like zooming out while still staying zoomed in. You get a sense of what's happening. It makes it easier on your eyes. And likewise, the black and white helper layer allows me to focus on just the tonality. And the reason why I think that's important is because the hairs that we want to fix are primarily the ones that stand out when the light is catching them. So not every single little fine hair is relevant, but the ones that stand out, like, for example, over here and over here, are ones that we really want to focus on. So let's jump in here, and we'll take the healing brush. And first, we'll sample on the face itself. It doesn't have to be exact. It just has to be somewhere in the vicinity. And I'm going to remove some of these hairs that catch my attention. As you notice, I'm not being really precise or anything like that. It's something that doesn't have to be rocket science. We're just going around and healing as we normally would. And you'll see this come together in a minute. So I'll start healing these little fine hairs. When I turn that layer on and off, you'll notice immediately that it really diminishes the effect of it quite drastically. And I think that's really wonderful, because with minimal effort, we're starting to minimize it. So I'll go around the face as well and do a few of these other pieces of hair. And the same thing goes for some of these areas where I just want to get rid of a couple of them, as well as this side of the face. It's amazing when you look at a portrait which is completely sharp, zoomed in, to see exactly how much detail somebody has. You almost learn things that you don't really notice typically. So when you look in the mirror, you don't notice things that are really prevalent in photographs, which is quite interesting. And also, when we deal with things that are on the edge, like this piece of hair here, what we'll do is, to get rid of this, we'll sample right on the edge. And then we'll brush with the edge intact. The reason why we do that is because if we sample under the chin and we try to brush that hair away, it's going to create a little fuzzy little patch. And to overcome that, we simply need to sample right on the edge and brush. And the reason this works is because we're taking the edge itself and transplanting it to another edge. And so Photoshop understands right away that we want to keep this edge, but we want to get rid of everything else that's different from that. So that's how that works. It's a really cool tool and technique to know, because this can become handy in any situation where you want to heal something where it's too close to an edge. If the healing brush is too hard for you, simply go to the clone brush, which is S, and then I'll bring my flow up to around 20% since we're trying to remove it really quickly. And then you can sample in that area. Just make sure that when you're sampling, you sample in the right shadow, because if you sample down here and you start brushing, what happens is the shadow gets really bright, and we don't want that. What we want to do is sample right on the shadow edge itself and then come here and brush it away. So you have two techniques to play with, using the healing brush and the clone brush to both take away that little piece of hair. Same thing goes over here. If I want to use my clone brush, I'll do the same thing. I'll brush that away. Let's zoom out here for a second. Obviously, what I would do is I would continue on through the rest of the face if we're trying to do everything. But let's say we're confining ourselves to one specific area, like this. Okay? We've already done the rest. The chin would be the same. I would go on continue healing. So there's nothing new over there. It's just a continuation of what we're doing so far. However, when I zoom out here really quick and turn this on and off, we take care of the ones that are most obvious. And what that does immediately is reduces the attention that that area is getting. Because of our helper layers, we're able to see exactly what we're going to focus on. Now, once the healing part is done, if we're trying to minimize some more of it, and we have a bigger area to focus on, we'll use the clone brush with a low flow again and finish off the image. So we'll take another layer, and we'll name this clone brush softening. And the first one, we'll name that healing brush and clone brush. Normally, I wouldn't recommend that you name every single layer every single time, but if you get in the habit of it, it makes things a lot easier if you're saving these layers and you want to go back in time and check it out. So I'll go back and click on the clone brush, but this time, before I begin working, what I want to mention is that this clone brush has to be relatively large, and it has to be as large as the area you're dealing with, because we're not going to completely replace what's on that area, but what we will do is we're going to soften it up gently. So we will use a 5% flow, hitting 0.5 on the keyboard, making sure that our buildup is checked. And now that we have 0.5 or 5%, we will simply come down to this area here on the side of the face, and we're going to sample from anywhere in that region. It doesn't have to be anywhere specific. It just has to match how dark or light that region is, okay? So watch what I do first, and I think it'll make more sense. If I want to minimize the appearance of this area here, I'll sample texture here, and then start brushing. If I turn that on and off, you'll notice that it feathers out the texture of that area. So I'll do the same thing here. I'll start brushing and getting rid of that. And the same thing goes for this area. I'll brush and get rid of that. So it kind of diminishes the appearance of that area when it comes to how rich it is. If for some reason you notice that as you turn it on and off, it's getting lighter or darker, you can easily dodge and burn to fix the difference in contouring. So for instance, because I use the clone brush and there's a lot of transitions happening, I want to simply darken this up a little bit. So I'll click on my burn tool or the burn adjustment layer. And just like we talked about in our dodge and burn section of the fundamentals, we will use the white brush and we'll set a low flow, about 2%, and I'll simply start brushing that in. And just like that, I'm able to minimize the skin texture there. And if I go too far, I'll just pull back a little bit. Another method, instead of using the clone brush, is you can use frequency separation. And this is a great area for us to talk about that as well. So if I name this really quickly, burn for contouring on the jaw. So let's say we turn off the clone brush part. Let's say we didn't have the clone brush as our option, or you want another way to do it. After I'm done with the healing stage, I'm going to click on the healing brush first. I'll make sure that my helper layers are turned off, because it's really imperative that anytime we run the frequency separation action, we want to turn off anything that's above the last layer that we're working on. We don't want the helper layers that are turned on, okay? So we'll run the frequency separation action, and we'll utilize a radius that is between 2 to 3. Typically 2 is fine if you're dealing with portraits that show half your body, or if you're dealing with a beauty shot, you want to do something like 3 or higher. So 2 is fine. I'm going to hit OK. And if you haven't checked out the frequency separation video as well, be sure to do so, because it gives you a big insight into how to use this and what it's about if you're not sure. So like we mentioned there, what we'll do is we'll come down here to that brush layer, where we will use this to complement some of the healing work that we've done. And we're going to even out some of the colors here. So I'll take my brush tool, and I'll use my Option key and sample that same color, and then I'll start brushing. And I'll do the same thing for some of these other contours. And if I turn that on and off, you'll notice that it softens up some of the colors of the fine hair. So what's happening is that what makes it stand out is actually the colors of the hair itself, because it's such a differentiation between hairs in that region that when you even that out just a little bit, it feathers it just enough where you don't notice it. But the texture is still prevalent because we have the texture on top. So there we go. We've minimized that. And let me show you a quick before and after of this region. I will take this little folder here and minimize that. So we have that in one group. Now when I turn off my eye, you'll notice that the healing brush took care of those fine hairs, and the frequency separation took care of a larger area. And again, as I mentioned, if you want to do it with a clone brush, you can as well, and then top it off with a little bit of contouring. So hopefully this tutorial gave you a few techniques on how to minimize some of the fine hairs on the face using both the healing brush and the clone brush, or the healing brush and frequency separation.